If you have a Bible, you can open to Philippians. And if you're one of the young kids in the room, there are Bibles in the pew. If you don't have your own, flip to the second half of the Bible, to the little books in the back, and you're going to Philippians, which was written by the Apostle Paul. It was a letter to a church in Philippi around 2,000 years ago. It's still very helpful. It's a good letter. It's full of joy. They were dealing with a lot of junk, and Paul wanted them to keep their joy and stay positive. Philippians chapter 3, and it's only one verse, and I'll have it on the screen. But I didn't want to tell you that because then you wouldn't have used your Bibles. I think it's good practice with kids to use a Bible. Okay, Philippians 3, verse 14. This is the only verse I'm going to preach on, and this will be a short sermon. It's not going to be that short. It's never that short. Paul says, I press on toward the goal to win the prize for which God has called me heavenward in Christ Jesus. I press on toward the goal to win the prize for which God has called me heavenward in Christ Jesus. Today we're going to dive into what I think is a familiar passage, Philippians 3, Philippians 4, those chapters about running the race and keeping our joy and maintaining a good attitude and finishing the race and remembering what the goal of that race is. We're going to think about all those things because I think at the turn of a new year, it's common sense to think about that. It's what we do. We make New Year's resolutions, right? The simple phrase, I press on, in Greek is only two words, dioko epi. So I want you to learn Greek with me this morning. Dioko, say dioko, epi. Dioko epi, I press on or I push forward. Okay, so now you know Koine Greek that people don't even speak anymore. It is similar to modern Greek. Anyway, dioko epi means I press on, but it's literally a picture of leaning forward. And so I asked the kids earlier in Sunday school, when they run a race, do they run like this? Right? That's like Weekend at Bernie's. I'm not recommending that movie necessarily. You guys are going to judge me, but it is a funny movie. Anyway, you don't run like that. You run lean forward. You want your momentum to push you forward. That's how you run in a race. And sometimes it's because it's all you got. You just have to push yourself forward like that. And so it's straining. It's pressing, pushing, squeezing, exerting force. It's this idea of straining every muscle in your body to make it to the finish line. It's a powerful phrase in Greek. It's a helpful phrase. It's a relentless pursuit. So, if you're anything like me, then you've probably already made plans for a new year. Goals. Often we call them resolutions. Things we have resolved to do, things we plan to do in the new year. How many of you have already thought about New Year's resolutions? You can be honest. Okay, raise your hands if you are anti-New Year's resolutions. Okay, I figured it would be like that. I will be honest with you. As someone who sometimes goes to a gym, I definitely see a mad rush of people in January, and by the end of February or March, most of them are gone. And I think that's true of most things. My app on my phone for Rosetta Stone gets used a lot in January, and then I don't remember anything I learned by the summer because I've quit using it. So I think that's true with the stack of books that I say I'm going to read by the end of 2025, and I'm sure it'll be half of the same stack from 2024 I still haven't finished. That's just my life. I resolve to do all kinds of things, and then I lose steam, and I lose momentum, and I don't finish the goal that I set for myself. I think that's common. I think that's human. But in Philippians, Paul's talking about more than just those quick fix goals, like reading a book or learning a new language or working out more. I think all those are good and healthy. You should set goals. I think it's good. But Paul's talking about something bigger and deeper than that. He's talking about the lifelong race of chasing after Christ-likeness, becoming like Jesus. This is the problem with a lot of Christianity. Christianity in our modern American context is just people going to religious services at churches where they all tend to agree on everything and bolster each other's opinions. That's not really Christianity. That's religious clubs, right? Christianity is a relentless pursuit of Jesus. It's to be like Christ. Jesus, who was gentle, compassionate, kind, loving, who brought the best out of people in his life, who gave his life to help others. That's Jesus. Most people love that. And I think most people would love Christians if they were authentically Christian. Now, the world will always buck back because the systems of this world operate out of fear, out of materialism and greed, out of overindulgence. There are a lot of things people do that are harmful, and so the world is going to resist that. But if we were to really be like Jesus, if we were to raise our kids to be like Jesus, they could change the world for the better. And I think that's a healthy goal for a new year, is to press in or press on toward Christ-likeness, to be more like Jesus at the end of this year, the next year, 2025, than you were at the end of this one. I think that's a good and healthy goal. So, before we dig deeper, I want to do a little activity with the kids. So if you're a kid in the room, 5th grade or under especially, but I don't care how old you are, come up front, please, to this open area. You can leave your trays. Leave your trays, just come up here. Not up here. Get off the stage, Graham. I'm just kidding, buddy. Just out here on the floor. Spread out, don't bump into each other. All right. And then any grown-ups who have thought about doing more cardio this year, you can do this too. You can stand up wherever you are. You don't have to come up front, but you could stand up. None of you are going to do it, are you? We're going to run in place, okay? We're going to run in place. Now you're definitely not going to do it. Okay. I'm going to set a timer. Spread out, spread out. You can go down the middle a little bit. You can go down the aisles on the sides. It's like herding cats. This is great. Okay. See, everybody spread out? Okay. I'm going to start a timer. Here's the only catch. I'm not going to tell you how long the timer is going to go, but you have to run, and I'm talking like high knees to your chest, running in place, okay? Everybody ready? Start. Get those knees up. Let's go. Don't slow down. You guys could cheer for them. Let's go. I want to see smiles. I want to see knees high to your chest. Kick your butt. Get those feet up. You guys are doing it. You're almost there. Keep going. Keep going. You're slowing down. Yes, you can't even cheer? Come on. Keep going. You're so close. I see some quitters. Let's go. Knees up. You're quitting. You're quitting. You're quitting. Okay, you can stop. I guess you can go back to your seats. Do they listen this well at home too? You guys did that for 5 whole minutes. No, that was just 1 minute. It felt like 5 minutes. So you didn't know how long I was going to make you do that. And I think that's helpful because one of the hardest things about life in the real world is that we don't have marked time frames for things, generally. And when we do, they often don't meet up with our expectations, and so we have to pivot and adjust. I think realistically, anyone who's trying to follow Christ has to be prepared for a sort of open-ended race, thinking more of a marathon than a sprint. You know what a marathon is, but if not, some of you kids may not know the difference. A marathon is 26.2 miles. It's long, whereas a sprint could be a very short distance. You just go super fast, right? But if you're going to run a marathon, you have to pace yourself and prepare for the long term. You have to be ready to go a long distance. And long distance running is in many ways very different than sprinting. So Paul is talking to some friends in the early church that I think had mentally prepared to run a sprint and get a trophy. And after 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 miles and cramping up and side stitches, they started complaining and saying, "When is this over?" And Paul said, "Soon enough. I can't tell you exactly when, but I can tell you it's worth it. It is worth it." The kids didn't know when they were going to get to stop, and some of them were already giving up. They couldn't even do it for 1 minute. The good news about what Paul says is that we're not running alone, and we do know what the prize is. So the goal is in sight, even if we don't know exactly when we're going to reach it. We know what it is. We know the goal. And we know the prize that awaits us, that it's an unimaginably great prize. And we know that in God's strength, with God's help, we can run the race. That message is for people who are 5 or 15 or 50 or 105, right? That message is for all of God's children, everyone who sets out on that journey with Jesus. So I only have 3 points and then some obstacles along the way, and then I'm going to wrap it up. I really am going to try to keep it short. Point number 1, if you're taking notes, you might want to write this down. Recognize the goal. Recognize the goal. In this case, purposeful discipleship. It's what I talked about earlier, becoming like Jesus. That's the goal of Christian faith. It's really nothing less than that, and it's not anything more than that. It is just to become like Jesus. That's how we honor God. It's how we worship rightly. It's how we love our neighbors, even as we love ourselves. Being like Christ. So it's discipling. That whole idea of pressing on comes from someone who knew a thing or two about tough times. The Apostle Paul is not, we say armchair theologians. He's not somebody that just sits and thinks about God and God's stuff. Paul was a persecuted, eventually a martyred missionary. He was Saul of Tarsus, who went by his Greek name, Paulos, and went into Greek territories preaching the gospel of Jesus, a Jewish Messiah, to people that many times thought he was foolish or crazy. And because of this, he was heavily persecuted at different times in his life. Paul was in and out of prison. At one point, he was locked up in a sewer in the city of Rome, and it's believed that at the end of his life, he was beheaded. It's a pretty dark story. Paul knew what it was like to struggle. He knew what it was like to suffer. He also knew what it was like to live comfortably, which might make it worse. People who have never been comfortable or wealthy don't really know what they're missing when they are finally in the clutches of poverty. But for Paul, he knew the height of being respected and loved and having plenty, and then he knew what it was like to be brought very low. Paul had felt the gambit of human experience. And so he says, I know from lived experience that this is hard, that it's tiring, that you're going to want to give up. But you can't. You cannot quit. You must not quit. The author of Hebrews, I don't believe it's Paul, but whoever it was, said similar things. You're running a race, and there are witnesses, people of great faith, who also didn't know what was going to be at the finish line, but they knew it was something great, and they pushed to the end. How could you give up now? You've got to push for all those people who have come before you. Press on. Do not give up. Paul knew that his journey is what made him more like Jesus. It's toward the end of his life that he says those famous words, that he's the chief among all sinners. What he meant was, not like I say a lot of bad words and I'm a bad boy. He meant, I've done horrific things to people. I said that because there are kids in the room, and we do a really bad job of explaining sin, and we give people toxic mental blocks when it comes to sin. Sin is bad stuff. Yes, parents do need to teach their kids to speak respectfully and use kindness and all that. Okay, but I'm telling you, sin is a much deeper, darker kind of thing. It's what makes people self-centered and greedy and violent and angry and quick-tempered and just vile, right? That's at its core. That's sin. It's what corrupts people on the inside. So when we think of sin, Paul is saying he's the chief of all sinners. That's what he's talking about. He doesn't mean I've done a lot of bad things. He means at one point in my life, I was so angry and bitter toward others that I was willing to watch them be killed because they didn't believe what I believed. He held the coats when they stoned Stephen, who was speaking out for Jesus. Paul, back then he was still known as Saul of Tarsus, he was holding their coats so that they could pick up stones and kill a man. And he thought that was cool. He was proud of that. He was zealous for God. Paul realizes that being really religious doesn't mean he's anything like Jesus. And he had had an awakening. After all these years of suffering and being persecuted and feeling upon himself the harm that he had caused to others, he finally realized, I didn't know Jesus at all. I didn't really know God. And I thought I was God's best little boy. And I was actually a terrible person. And so then he says, I had to put away all that childish stuff. And he writes in Corinthians, something we read at weddings, in 1 Corinthians 13, he writes about love. But he's not talking about marital love. I think it should be marital love too. But he's talking about just love. Love is patient and kind. It doesn't envy. It doesn't boast. It's not arrogant. It's not self-serving. It doesn't like deceit and secrets. It likes the truth. It's all these beautiful things. And then he goes on to say that it is self-sacrificing. It lays its life down for another. The Saul that we meet in the beginning of his story was someone who would take life from another to prove his point. The Saul we meet later as Paul the Apostle is a man who will give his life for the good of others. That's transformation. That happened through years of suffering and persecution, through running a race that was very difficult. And so he writes a letter to his friends and says, you can't give up. I know because I chose not to give up, and God has done great things for me and through me. And it's not like at the end Paul says, now I earned my prize. It's as if he realizes by the end of the race he could have never earned it, and that's what makes it so wonderful. It's a gift. It's a gift. Romans 8:29 tells us that God's purpose is to conform us into the image of Christ. That's the goal, to be in the image of Christ. Not just being nice people, it's letting every part of our lives reflect Jesus. Our words, our attitudes, our actions, everything we do, how we react when things don't go as planned, all of it. John Baer, one of my favorite theologians, says becoming Christ-like is a radical recentering of our hearts. You don't just add a little Jesus flavor to your routine. It's letting God change our routine entirely. St. Augustine of Hippo, 1,600 years ago, said, our hearts are restless until they rest in you. That's my favorite Augustine quote. Our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you, referring to Jesus. Anything short of Christ will leave us unfulfilled. We must become like Jesus. So how do we do that? Well, maybe set some realistic spiritual goals. Regular prayer. Just talk to God, right? It's not complicated. It doesn't need to be showy or flashy or spectacular. Just throughout your day, take moments, quiet moments, and talk to God. Then find ways to be kind in ordinary moments. Imagine how much better life would be if we showed more kindness in all those ordinary moments day to day. That might look like speaking to a family member or a friend that otherwise we might have ignored or neglected. It might just be making a call or sending a text. Maybe it's seeing someone in need and finding a way to help that person. Not just financially, maybe with your time. Someone just seems lonely and isolated, and you spend some time with them and make them feel loved and cared for. Find ways to check in with people and help them. And find people to support you. You can't do this alone. Surround yourself with loving support. Surround yourself with other people who are like-minded, who want to love and show God's concern for the world around them. Work together. So that's the path. It's discipleship. It's becoming like Jesus. The second point is to embrace the struggle. On that path, things will be difficult. It's not easy to be a selfless person. It's not easy to do what is right. It's often the harder thing to do. But it is the right thing to do, so we have to do it. So we persevere as we grow. Paul says in Philippians 3:13, the verse right before what we read, that he forgets what's behind him and strains toward what is ahead. So he's making it clear he can't sit and live in the past. You can't sit around and have regrets and what ifs and woulda, coulda, shouldas. That's not a way to live your life. You have no access to the past. All you have is the present moment. You can hope for the future, but you don't really even have that. All you have is this present moment. That's why mindfulness is so wonderful, to just spend some time every day meditating or praying in the quiet and becoming mindful of your present moment, which is sadly something that's been lost in a lot of modern Christianity, unless you go in the Eastern world. But mindfulness is a Christian concept. Jesus is the one who told us to be present right now. He said you can't change the past and you have no control over the future. All you have is right now. So use this moment. Connect with God and connect with the people around you. Hebrews 12 says we have to run with perseverance a race that has been marked out for us. So it's helpful to know that the race is already set. We're not stumbling through, and then when we hit obstacles, we have to wonder, why is this happening? We can rest assured, whatever circumstances and difficulties and obstacles come up, God has already arranged for us to overcome them. Doesn't mean it's easy, but it's also not accidental or destructive, right? God will use even the evil things of this world, even people's bad intentions. God can work together for good. He can bring good out of it. God does that all the time. He'll give us the strength to keep going. Dallas Willard said, grace is not opposed to effort. Grace is opposed to earning. That's another really good quote. Grace is not opposed to effort, which is, I feel like, what a lot of us are taught in church. God doesn't need you to try harder. Just accept his gift of grace and rest in that. Yeah, yes, but he does want you to try harder, right? I will give my kids what they need because they're my kids, but I still want them to try to be good and decent people, right? If they're not, I'm not going to forbid them from dinner and be like, you're not eating today. You shouldn't have talked back to me earlier, so you're going to starve, right? No good father would ever do that, right? But we think like that sometimes about God. Like if we screw up, then he's waiting to take away the blessings. No, he freely gives the blessings, but that doesn't take away our responsibility with the blessings. In fact, the greater the blessing, the greater the responsibility. I hope that made sense. Grace is opposed to earning. We don't merit God's favor. We don't prove that we're his kids. We are his children, and he says we are beloved. You are a beloved child of God. Every one of you in this room, every person you ever meet in your life, created by God with purpose because God loves that person as they are, without you changing them, okay? I hope you understand that. But that doesn't mean that those people don't need to work toward being good and kind and faithful. There is a responsibility on us as the children of God to do good things, to bless others, to align with God's own character. Richard Rohr says it like this: we don't think ourselves into new ways of living, we live ourselves into new ways of thinking. That quote is actually a tiny bit controversial, I think, but I like it, okay? We don't think ourselves into new ways of living, we live ourselves into new ways of thinking. You chew on that this week. I thought about Joseph in the Bible, in Genesis 37 through 50. Famous story. Joseph, the favorite son of Israel, of Jacob. And he is hated by his brothers, right? He's basically left for dead in a pit, sold off into slavery, forgotten in a prison cell. Eventually, through all of his trials, he remains faithful. He remains dedicated to God. He trusts God. And by the end of his story, he rises to a position of great power, and he uses that power to save people during a famine. Don't miss that. The goal of Joseph finally gaining power was that by the time he got there, he knew what power was for. He used his power to save hungry people and forgive his wicked brothers. That's how power works when you understand it. He didn't finally get the power he wanted and crush his brothers and save up all the food for his family. Instead, he gave generously and forgave generously. That's how godly power works. But Joseph only knew how to exercise his power at the end of his journey because of all the trials he experienced along his journey. If Joseph had gone straight from Jacob's house as a boy to Pharaoh's palace as a second in command in Egypt, I don't think he would have done the same things. People don't really stop and think about that. We just feel sorry for Joseph. I don't feel sorry for Joseph. I envy him because he became a great man of God. That's all I can hope for myself, is that I would be forgiving and generous at the end of my life. If it takes some obstacles to get me there, so be it. But don't quit. You cannot give up. Point number 3, keep an eternal perspective. We're thinking about the end of the journey. That's kind of the point. The goal is to reach Christ-likeness. It is to be one with God forever. And I'm not talking about playing a harp on a cloud somewhere, some medieval weird concept of heaven. I'm talking about a new reality, new heavens, new earth, where all people live the way they were meant to live together in harmony, the way God intended people to live, as beloved children who love one another in his kingdom, serving him rightly, sharing and loving. It's this ultimate hope. Revelation tries to describe it. People have tried to describe it. I don't think it's describable. It is beyond human comprehension because we live in a broken and fractured world. We can't even imagine what true peace looks like, what real love feels like. We get glimpses, little things that remind us that it's out there, but none of us have experienced it yet. And so the Bible repeatedly tells us this great promise awaits you, this thing you can't even begin to fathom, but you got to get there. You can't stop before you get there. You've got to push on, press on, keep leaning forward. Don't give up. Philippians 3:20, just several verses later, Paul says, our citizenship is in heaven, or in heavenly places. We're not just running for a short-term victory. I think maybe that was the Philippians' problem. They had started a church in Philippi. They were beginning to follow Jesus, and they were probably under the assumption, if we follow Jesus, there won't be any more struggle. God will fix all of our problems. And then that didn't happen. They still had problems. They probably had new problems, right? They probably had all new stuff to have to deal with on top of their regular life problems. And so Paul writes them a letter and says, don't lose your joy. This isn't about a quick victory. This is about long-term gains. You are investing for the future. You're going to have to be patient to see the results. C.S. Lewis said, aim at heaven, you get earth thrown in, but if you aim at earth, you get nothing. I try to put all the fun little New Year's quotes I could in here, okay? Little things for you to remember. Gregory of Nyssa, I've told you before, is my favorite early church leader, Gregory of Nyssa. He used a term in Greek that's really great. It's epiktasis. Epiktasis. It's reaching up. So it's not unlike diakoepi, what Paul said here, pressing forward. But Gregory of Nyssa said, what if we're reaching up? And he said it's like a constant upward climb toward God. And I had a professor in college named Dave Wheeler, and he would always say, he was an older guy, and he would say, the closer he gets to a bright light, the more wrinkles he could see. And he was talking about Paul when he said he was the chief among sinners. And he said, how could Paul say that at a point in his life where he was doing so many great things? He had helped so many people. Well, it's because he had drawn so close to God that he could see how imperfect he really was. It humbled him. It made him self-aware. That's not a bad thing. It's good to be drawn into the light and see more and more places to improve. And the good news is you can improve. God can help you to keep growing and bettering yourself, to be better for others. I think we would be kidding ourselves if we thought that this would somehow just go smoothly, that you could start to follow Jesus, try to be like Jesus and love God and love your neighbors and do what is right and make the world a better place and then eventually be part of the new heavens and new earth and not face difficulties. So I'm going to talk about the things in my brain when I used to run long distance. I remember there were specific things that would continue to happen every time I ran in a race, and I would have to think preventatively. I would have to plan for it. Eat certain things before a race, drink a certain amount of water, and then only drink so much during when they give you the little Gatorade cups and all that kind of stuff. Like my brain had to process what I was doing at any given moment because I knew certain bad decisions at the wrong time could really detrimentally affect my race. Any of you who have ever run long distance or done any kind of endurance sport, you know what I'm talking about. Little decisions can make a big, lasting difference. And so I thought about that related to our spiritual walk. And here's what I came up with. First, spiritual apathy. I think there are times when God feels far away, when he feels distant in your life. Prayer feels dry or empty. When I was a kid, people would say prayers were hitting the ceiling or bouncing off the ceiling, which was a clever way of saying they weren't getting all the way to God, because people used to think God was up there somewhere in the clouds. Of course, God is everywhere, right? Again, we don't have time for all this. Spiritual apathy. You know what you do when you become apathetic? You keep showing up. This is that Richard Rohr quote. You don't think yourself into new ways of living. You live yourself into new ways of thinking and feeling. If it feels like God is far away, then keep showing up with God and see if he doesn't show up. See if you don't begin to recognize his presence in ways you weren't. But don't give up. You keep showing up. You persist in prayer. You lean into community. If you feel isolated, you find support. Trust that God can break through that and bring fresh life, fresh energy. Second, busyness and distraction. This time of year especially, we are busy. We are distracted. It is easy to lose touch. It's easy to forget that we're trying to run a race, that we have these big goals. And so we kind of slump into complacency and distraction. We just keep doing the same old things and going through the motions, and we lose steam. I think that our schedules can sabotage us in this race. Sometimes you have to consciously create a margin. You have to set apart time, like 10 or 15 minutes a day. How many of you realistically think you could set aside 10 to 15 minutes a day for quiet and solitude? Just maybe a little meditating or practice some mindfulness and deep breathing and talk to God. Surely you could do it 10 to 15 minutes a day, and that will make such a difference to just break your schedule for a second and focus with God. In fact, statistically, it's pretty well proven that if you were to do that, your schedule will be more efficient in the long run. It's good to pause and have a little time of mindfulness. Thirdly, fear of opinions. We worry about what people think. I worry more than some of you do, but it's one of my great curses in life. I worry a lot about what people think of me. And I've worked hard to overcome that, but it's still there. It'll probably always be there. I want people to like me. I want people to think I'm great and smart and all these things. It's I think it's a part of being human, and it's probably just my insecurity. But I know some of you share that. I know some of you hit that obstacle, and part of what slows you down is the fear of what others will think. I wish I had an easy answer for that. All I can say is just keep trying not to care what other people think. Do what is right. Don't do what seems popular or convenient. It's easy to be distracted by other people's opinions. Galatians 1, verse 10, again, Paul, the apostle, says, "Am I now trying to please people or God?" And that question is a gut check for me regularly. The things I'm saying, the things I'm doing with my life, am I still trying to please people or am I trying to please God? And again, by pleasing God, I mean doing the things that show love to God and to my neighbors. Am I doing things that make me blend in and feel normal and be well received by the people around me? Or am I doing the right things for the right reasons to love and help people? That's a tough question. The fourth one is unresolved sin. This one's obvious, but if you have hidden bad habits or addictions or things that sort of skeletons in the closet, things that you haven't dealt with, even if it's past trauma and you need to talk to a mental health expert, which we highly recommend at this church. Mental health is so important. Deal with that stuff. Get the help you need. It is very hard to run this race when you are sidetracked by a lot of these negative things that you haven't dealt with in your life. So if you have some kind of addictive habit or some trauma in your past that you need help with, find help. And if you need help, talk to me after church. You can call or text me privately. I would love to try to refer you and get you the help you need. And at the very least, I will talk to you. We can have coffee and talk. Okay. James 5:16 encourages us to open up and confess sin and talk about things with one another. I think we should do that. The last one is isolation, which I kind of mentioned already, but everybody knows the verse, as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. That's helpful advice. It's good wisdom. We need each other. You cannot run this race alone. You cannot. I swear to you, anytime my roommate and I ran, he and I were both on the cross-country team in college. Anytime we ran together to practice, we always ran further. I don't know how, but always, without fail, we went further than if we had run alone. I would say a practice run would have been at least a mile or 2 miles shorter if he were not running with me. But that extra person beside you saying, come on, when you start to cramp up and they push you to keep going, and then later they cramp up and you push them to keep going. It's that teamwork, that camaraderie, that solidarity with other people who are sharing the struggle. We need that. That's why church is so important. So stay connected to one another. I put all this together and I started to think about kindergarten basketball, first grade basketball. So Cody is coaching our kids' basketball team, and Cody's a great guy. He's too nice, to be honest. That's why the kids are kind of bratty sometimes, because he's too nice to other people's kids. But my kids, you can do whatever you need to do, okay? But anyway, he's such a sweet guy, and he'll make them run laps, right? Because what else can you do to kids that age? So he'll be like, all right, guys, if you're not going to listen, let's run a lap. But my favorite is when he makes them run 2 or 3 laps and doesn't say how many. He's like, all right, just keep running. Just keep running. Well, after the first lap, when they're like, aren't we done? You say, no, keep going. We'll tell you when you're done. But you don't tell them a number. They lose steam real quick, right? They all start to give up. They're cutting corners. We have to put dads on the corners and say, nope, go all the way around. Go all the way around. I hope you can visualize what I'm talking about. This sermon reminded me of that. Just a couple weeks ago, I was thinking about the kids running laps, and it's so easy to start to give up and quit and cut corners when you don't know what the goal is, when you don't have an idea of how long you're going to have to run. That's why it's so important that we encourage one another, that we keep pushing forward, that we don't give up. We need that. Would you stand with me as we close? We just finished the Christmas season, Advent season. We're preparing for a new year. Advent is all about Emmanuel, God with us. And what I want you to leave today remembering is that you are not running alone. You're not just running with one another, which is part of it. It is a team. You are running with Christ. We do not serve a God who sits up in heaven and just watches us struggle. That's a deity that is far removed. We serve a God who put on flesh and walked among us and cares for us intimately. A God who walks with us, not aloof and far away. He cares for you. He's with you. He says, take my yoke. Let me help you carry this weight. Jesus is like no one else, and he will help you finish the race that he's marked out for you. So, I understand some of you are probably facing Mountains in your life that are so tall, you don't know how you could get over it. Races that seem so long, you don't know how you could ever finish and not just collapse. I don't know if it's financial struggles, you're worrying about paying bills, God forbid, foreclosing on a house, or putting groceries on the table, or keeping your car on the road. Maybe it's betrayal, a friend or a spouse who has left your heart broken in pieces. Maybe it's just depression, even clinical depression that you can't seem to treat effectively, and you just feel sad and isolated and overwhelmed and anxious. Maybe it's physical illness, and you aren't able to do the things that you want to do in your brain. Your body just doesn't do it. I don't know. There's so many ways that life presents struggles, and I'm sure I've captured a lot of you in just those little descriptions. Whatever it is, even if it feels unbelievably difficult, I'm telling you not to give up. God is with you, and God loves you, and God will give you strength to overcome it. He will help you get through. And on the other end, on the other side, you will be better for it. I don't know how. I don't think it makes a lot of sense on this side of the finish line, but somehow on that side of the finish line, you will be better off. And the prize is worth the race. So run. Don't slow down. Don't get sidetracked or distracted. Don't give up. Run your race with joy.